Tom Wright, or N.T. Wright as he may be better known, is one of our favorite human beings here at the Lanier Theological Library and Learning Center. He has made 5, maybe 6 visits here to speak since 2014. He is lecturing for the George W. Truett Theological Seminary at Baylor University on, of all things, the book of Isaiah. Perhaps we should call him O.T. Wright. The Truett Houston program meets on our campus. You can pursue several master's degrees from Truett right here in Houston, and N.T. Wright can be one of your instructors. Tom joined me on the Stone Chapel podcast to discuss Paul's correspondence to the Corinthians because he is here to lecture on the challenge of being a bit too comfortable, like the Corinthians, in our culture. Now, the Stone Chapel podcast is part of the Church Leaders Podcast Network. The network is led by Ed Stetzer, Dean at Talbot Seminary at Biola. We are dedicated to providing resources for pastors and church leaders as they negotiate the treacherous roads in and through our culture. You can learn more about that at ChurchLeaders.com/podcast network. Today on the Stone Chapel podcast, Nicholas Thomas Wright. Enjoy.
Hello, I'm Tom Wright, or you may know me as N.T. Wright, perhaps, and I'm long retired, but now Senior Research Fellow at Wycliffe Hall in Oxford.
Dr. Tom Wright, good to see you. Welcome back to Stone Chapel.
Yeah, good to be here. I'm looking forward to the lecture.
You're going to be in the Stone Chapel tomorrow night giving the lecture here on 1 Corinthians. And it's just a delight to welcome you and Maggie back. First time to meet Maggie.
Sure. Maggie finally made it here, which I've been trying to persuade her to come, but she's always worried about heat. She doesn't do heat well. So
this is a hot weekend, I'm afraid.
That's all right.
Let's keep her in the AC.
Keep her in the AC, absolutely.
That's true. All right, so you're going to be talking about 1 Corinthians for this lecture. You've talked about Gospels before. You've talked about Paul before, but we're back on Paul this time.
Yeah, back on Paul this time. And this is a particular theme which had never occurred to me. And actually, I've got a little project I'm trying to work on at the moment, which is called 50 Things I Wish I'd Known 50 Years Ago, because there's all sorts of things now which seem to me enormously important in the New Testament, which none of us were talking about. When I was a keen teenage Christian studying the Bible, when I was first ordained in my mid-20s, teaching young people to study the Bible, things which never crossed our paths, but which now seem really important. One such thing jumped up and bit me on the nose some years ago when I was reading Bruce Winter, the Australian New Testament scholar, who's a trained ancient historian, talking about what happens in Acts 18 when Paul is in Corinth. He's teaching in the synagogue. They grumble, they don't like it, they throw him out, so he goes across the street to a house and continues to teach. Right. And then the Judeans, which is the word I now prefer to use rather than Jews, because Jews has all sorts of modern connotations as well.
Exactly.
But the Judeans drag him before the Roman proconsul, Gallio, and say, this man is teaching us to do things which are contrary to the law, because the Romans had given permission for the Judeans to worship in their own way, and, equally important, for the Judeans not to have to worship the gods. The deal they struck, according to Josephus, was that the Judeans will pray to their God for Rome and Caesar, but they will not pray to Rome or Caesar. And most of the Caesars, with the notable exception of Caligula particularly, said, fine, okay, we can live with that. A lot of local people didn't much like it, because if people stop worshipping the gods, then bad things are going to happen to the city. But anyway, so that's what's behind this. And so the Judeans bring Paul before Gallio, and Gallio basically says, nothing to see here. This is just a little dispute about words and names in your own law, and it's nothing to do with Roman law. Push off. And the mob love this because they don't really like the Judeans, or much of them, and they beat up the ruler of the synagogue right in front of the tribunal, which is kind of a nasty bit of local colour. That's the kind of culture that it was. Bruce Winter's point, based on this, was, well, for the first time, Rome has said, Christianity is legal because it's a sub-branch of the Judaic way of life. In other words, the Judaic way already has Roman permission. Gallio says, as far as I'm concerned, it's all part of the same thing. Now, the Judeans in Corinth will have been furious at that because suddenly all these Gentiles who have come into the church are now able to be free from worshipping the gods in the same way that the Judeans are. But Bruce Winter's point was, from that point on, Christianity is legal in southern Greece. Corinth is the beginning of southern Greece when you come over the peninsula from Athens. It means that the gospel can spread. People are not going to be put in jail. So by contrast with, and you just think where Paul's been, he's been stoned in southern Turkey, he's been imprisoned with walls falling down and stuff in Philippi, he's been chased out of Thessalonica, he's been laughed out of court in Athens, and suddenly now, hey guys, this thing is legal. Now, fine. So I lived with that thing which Bruce Winter argued for some years and just thought, isn't that splendid? At last Rome is seeing the point. And in the course of Acts, there are other Roman centurions and people who think that actually the Christians are quite good people. And Luke is naturally writing that up. But then it dawned on me, this is actually the best explanation for many, if not all, of the problems that Paul is dealing with in 1 Corinthians. Because suddenly the church is comfortable. It's the only set of letters, 1 and 2 Corinthians, which doesn't have any mention of the persecution that you're currently facing. Okay, with the exception of Philemon and the pastorals. But the others are all about your opponents, the persecutions, the sufferings you're having to go through, etc. Not in Corinth. They're doing fine, thank you very much. And so 1 Corinthians 4, already you're rich, already you're kings. Gee, I wish I was with you. I could be a king too. Wouldn't that be fun? And you get this picture of the comfortable Corinthians where the church door is open. Hey guys, we're having a party. Let's see, this is this new religious thing that's in town, and the Roman governor seems quite happy with it. So you get a bit of the Judaic culture, but you also get all these new fun experiences, like there are people who prophesy in there, they speak in tongues. Let's go and see what's going on. So a great mixed multitude floods into the church. And before you know what's happening, you have personality cults, you have sexual immorality, you have being careless about the poor, you have people being clueless about some of the basics of Christian worship, and particularly no idea what all this talk about resurrection would be. And they've got an outline of 1 Corinthians, but it makes sense in terms of suddenly this is popular, this is public, this is easy, this is open, this is not being persecuted.
Not being taken seriously.
Well,
in a way.
Not being taken seriously. So my thesis is basically, let's face it, we're all Corinthians now. When I first thought this thought, my thought was, I'm a member of the Church of England. The Church of England is an established church. So obviously this is our problem. We are the Corinthians, and maybe the free churches and the Baptists and whoever, they're in a better place. But actually no. Ever since the 18th century in England, any Christian of pretty much any variety, it's all open season. There are no secret police at the door counting you in or taking photographs of you or whatever. We're all able to do our own thing. And here in America, likewise, nobody's coming after you for going to church on Sunday, whichever church it may be. And as a result, we're not being persecuted, although if we take extreme positions, sometimes the newspapers will go after us and have a pop at us about this and that. But basically, as with the Corinthians, I think we've lost the art of what Paul is desperate to inculcate, which is to hold fast the way of Jesus the Messiah, to hold fast to Jesus as Lord, and to figure out rather seriously what that's going to look like for a community, about unity, about humility, about all things are yours, whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas or anyone. In other words, no personality cults, please, because we're focused on Jesus, not on these different human leaders. So it's basically then a challenge that from one point of view, a la Bruce Winter, this is great news for the early church. We're legal at last.
Legal, yeah. We don't have to worry here.
Exactly. But then watch out for the downside of that when we get careless, people will just come in and treat it as a hobby. It's like, I play tennis on a Wednesday night, chess on a Thursday night, and I go to this thing called church on Sunday. Isn't that nice?
More than oh, wow. Yeah, I hadn't thought about it in those particular terms. When you think about what happened in the early church, and we think about all the persecution, we think how horrible that must have been, how terrible and such. But there's a sense in which persecution, it becomes a defining moment for the early Christians. I mean, Jesus told us.
Absolutely.
And he expected you hold this gospel to be true, and you teach it and you preach it, and you're going to face persecution.
Sure, the principalities and powers ain't going to like it.
No.
Yeah.
The fact that culture, which I think is a representative of the principalities powers a lot of times, the kind of cultural moments that we enter into, suggests that when we are comfortable, that there is maybe something wrong.
Well, which is difficult because from one point of view, that could easily tip over into a kind of radical dualism. Where we say, okay, in that case, we're just going to be cross-grained and awkward and shout at everybody about everything and do our own thing and have no truck with these people down the street. Paul is never like that. I became all things to all people that I might by all means win some. And if an unbeliever invites you to dinner and you're minded to go, that's fine. And then there are rules for how you might or might not treat the food that's put in front of you. But here's how to navigate those situations. So Paul isn't shrinking away from that. Where Christians have been aware of the danger of compromise, then often, as with, say, the closed brethren movement in the 19th and early 20th century, they've gone into a little holy huddle where they and only they are the real believers, and where there is literally somebody at the door checking you out and seeing if you're allowed in or not. If you're not known to be a believer or possibly coming with letters of reference from another similar community elsewhere, in which case, fine, okay, welcome, you're a brother, you're a sister. But without that, we're not sure if you're real or not. And sadly, some people play that game these days. I had an email just a day or two ago from somebody warning me about the dangers of being associated with somebody who's actually a friend of mine of 20 years standing. I won't name him, but saying, actually, I don't think he's a Christian. And I was, excuse me, I know this guy. We've prayed together. We've worked together. If he's not a Christian, then I don't know what is. So you can be too defensive, but when we avoid being defensive, we haven't really developed the navigational skills of avoiding the over-defensiveness at the same time as avoiding the casual compromise where anything goes because we're now legal, so who cares? It's all fair in love and war and religion. Yeah.
We've kind of moved from now we're legal to let's run the place. I mean, that's the other danger.
Well,
isn't it? That's the other side okay, we don't want to just be legal. We want to be in charge.
Yeah. Now,
and we think it all should reflect our own
Which
thinking.
is interesting because certainly you in America, I think it's even in your constitution that church and state never the twain shall meet.
Yeah,
because
there are statements like that. Yeah,
I think
they're disputed, but
well, this is the thing. They obviously come from a time when the founding fathers and others like them had escaped religious persecution in the old world, in Europe and Britain. And so they didn't want to set up a similar system over here. So everything has to be separate. Although, from what little I know about the original New England colonies, that there were Presbyterian bits geographically and Episcopalian bits geographically, etc. So already there's some navigation going on there. But I was always taught as a young Christian that the Sermon on the Mount is not an agenda for Parliament to put into the statute book. This is about personal devotion to Jesus and following him, etc. And I still want to say partly that there is a truth in that, but I do also want to say that actually the Western world at its best has tried to instantiate care for the poor, education, medicine, etc. In other words, things which are ruling the world from one point of view, but then you run into, and always be my go-to passage, Mark 10, where James and John say, we want to sit to your right and your left, and Jesus said, you have no idea what you're talking about. And then he says, listen, the rulers of the Gentiles boss and bully and get their way by beating people up. We're going to do it the other way. The one who wants to be great among you must be your servant. Now, if the people in your culture or mine who say because we're Christians we should be ruling the world, if they would actually take that seriously, then the way you rule the world is the Sermon on the Mount way. The meek, the mourners, the hungry for justice people, the peacemakers, the pure in heart, the poor in spirit. Now, if people were so determined to rule the world in Jesus' way that they embraced those values, I would say fantastic. Yeah. You may not get elected to Congress.
No,
but
I don't
my
think
goodness,
anybody
but wherever you are, you will be bringing the rule of God to bear. And that's what's happened. I mean, Tom Holland's book, Dominion, is very clear.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
It's a great story of how what we think today and how we think today in our culture has been largely fashioned by Christianity.
Exactly.
We may have left the metaphysics behind, but we still embrace much of what brought us to this, has brought us to this moment.
Absolutely. And I remember, I think it was Bishop James Jones in England making the point very powerfully in a lecture where people say, we live in an amoral age. He said, absolutely not. Think about South Africa. The fall of apartheid was because the world as a whole looked and said, you cannot treat people like that just because they're from a different ethnic group. Now, in the ancient world, who cared about that? Not a big deal. The world actually has, even when being officially atheist, has often, not always, embraced a great many things which actually do come to it from the Christian background. Problem is, as Pope Benedict said, probably on more than one occasion, but I heard one of them, the Judeo-Christian values which underpin Western civilization, once you stop believing in, as you said, the metaphysical bits and pieces, then watch out in case you're cutting off the root of the tree, because if that happens, you may get fruit next year, but probably not the year after that. And that's a real challenge for us.
That's a gentle erosion that might take a decade or half a lifetime or so to take place.
And some such things be a very slow erosion to start off with, and then quite suddenly the tree will blow over in a gale. And you think, look, it was rotten at the core and we didn't realize.
Yeah. It's interesting, your whole thesis reminds me of the fact that it seems like with the Corinthian church, Paul had his biggest problem.
I think so, yes.
In a sense, because they were comfortable, because they were sitting there. It was the other churches that he said, the testimony of your faith is being broadcast throughout the world.
Absolutely.
I'm so proud of you. You're great.
And that's the Thessalonians, and they were suffering. They were being persecuted. They're presumably losing their jobs or having bricks through their windows or whatever. Of course, in Galatia, he's pretty cross with them.
Yes,
but
true.
He's teasing them in some ways and trying to woo them round. But yes, Philippians, Thessalonians, Ephesians, Colossians, they are all facing all sorts of challenges, but not the comfortable one.
The challenge of being too comfortable.
Challenge of being too. And of course, the silly thing is, I don't want to be uncomfortable.
No,
I like being able to live in a funny little house with churches and chapels within easy walking distance and just take my choice and go off to evensong here or to a Eucharist there. That's very nice, thank you. And I don't want the secret police waiting at the door to photograph me and then warn me that if I turn up too often, they're going to deport me or something.
Right.
But I remember ages ago hearing a sermon in which somebody said, supposing they were putting people on trial for being Christians, would there be enough evidence to convict you? And oh my goodness, isn't that interesting?
Yeah, I remember hearing that back during the Jesus movement here.
I think that's
where it started back in the 70s or
60s or 70s. Yes. No, I think that's where it is.
Would there be enough evidence to convict you? Oh, wow.
Yeah.
It's going to be a great lecture. We're looking forward to it. For those of you that I cannot be here, it'll be available on our YouTube channel. We hope you'll check it out there. Tom Wright, thanks for being with us today here on the Stone Chapel Podcast.
Thank you very much. Good to be with you.
Today's podcast is designed to summarize Tom Wright's public lecture here on June 7th, 2025. After you hear the podcast, you can go to our YouTube channel at Lanier Theological Library and watch Tom's lecture and PowerPoint. It's about 55 minutes in length, and he goes into more detail than he was able to do here on the podcast. We look forward to his next visit, 2026 maybe. Thanks to our podcast team, Kathy Capes, my wife, our audio editor, Jana Firestone, and Jessica Mauser, our Church Leaders Podcast Network producers. And Phil Keggy, thanks for our intro and outro music. If you found something helpful in this podcast, please like and subscribe to it. Tell a friend or two about us. That will help more people find us among the many thousands of podcast options out there. We hope you have a good week. Join us again next Tuesday. Until next time, I'm David Capes, and thanks for listening.